Do you think there's an argument to be made on the other side that we're not covering it enough, that we're trying to sanitize it, that by not showing the images, as you said, that by not sort of, going over every single incident?
Well, can I, firstly, the press already, the media already does a fair amount of editorializing before you even get to the discussion we're having. Let me give you one example. ISIS, which is the subject of Fawaz's book.
Thank you.
If you'd like to hold it up again. No, I'm not. I've got a 10% deal on this. ISIS now the main broadcaster here in the UK, the one that we all pay for, the one that is, I think, responsible for the fact that our media is not as divided as it is in, for instance, in America. There's much to be said for the BBC. The BBC chose to not use that term. It's so-called Islamic State, as the BBC. Well, that's an editorial decision it takes about the group. I've often said, I keep on hearing the BBC called the so-called Islamic State more times, I'll put my so-called shoes through the so-called television. But it's an infuriating editorial decision, which they've taken before you've even got to reporting the story. That's why you can speak to a lot of people in this country who, despite this, what we're talking about here as being an over-coverage, still have very little idea of what it is that ISIS wants. Because we actually don't have a lot of that discussion, because our broadcasters and our press don't want to have a lot of that discussion. And so we go round and round on the pornography of violence. I'd much rather we had those bigger and deeper discussions that meant that people knew what was actually going on with this group and what they actually want and what groups like them want. But just very quickly, I've got to pick up as well on this mention about Sweden, if I may, because this actually does get to a core divide that's going on at the moment. I do not enjoy the bifurcation of American media, I have to say. I don't like the fact that increasingly these are two sides talking about each other, but never to each other. And I think it's enormously regrettable for democracy as a whole. That said, there is a specific problem which the Sweden story actually talks to. Now, as it happens, I've just finished a book which Fawaz will be, by agreement, promoting any moment. No, which comes out in May. But it's about the migration crisis in Europe. And I've been spending quite a bit of time in Sweden, among other countries. And there are, now it's not terrorism on a daily basis, but there are so many societal problems that have broken out in Sweden in the last few years. And you very, very rarely see anything about it in the press and the media in this country or in America. And I think that what happened in this is emblematic of a problem. So the media doesn't cover the story. Okay, you could say, well, who cares about Sweden? Or it's just, it's just this. But the fact is that it's the non-coverage of that, of a very serious story, and then a sort of cack-handed reference to it by the American president that is responded to by the liberal media saying, ha, 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 it's so hilarious. Sweden's just this wonderful place where everyone's just doing IKEA stuff all the time, is a horrible, horrible deepening of the divide. Obama refuses to say the term Islamic extremism when a man shouting Allahu Akbar at Fort Hood kills a dozen Marines. It was described famously as workplace violence. And so this thing comes up. What are they holding from us? Why are they lying to us? We can see what it is. Why are you not saying that the guy shouting Allah is greatest whilst gunning people down may be doing it for theological reasons? And you start to do the contrary thing. And that's why you now get, as I say, this situation. It's the same thing, as I say, with the migration, with European politics and all this stuff. The public aren't onto nothing when they're worried that the media is holding some of this stuff back from them. Barack Obama was berated at the UN by David Cameron for this. It was Cameron who said at the UN a year or so ago, it's not enough that you say it has nothing to do with religion. You've got to admit it has to do something with religion in order to deal with it. But we are creating contrary forces all the time at the moment. The rhetoric matters, but obviously it isn't everything, as the President is finding out. I mean, obviously you have to have a viable policy behind it. It's just that people are quite rightly worried that an absence of rhetoric, or at least apparent unwillingness to get right into the weeds on it, is part of the problem, and just would suggest that you might not actually want to be grappling with it. It's like, I don't know, it's like when you speak to someone, you say, how would you deal with terrorism? And they say something like, we've got to deal with poverty. And you think, oh, God, well, we'll do that one soon, I'm sure. And so, I mean, it's so vague as to be obviously meaningless. As I said, is obviously, to my mind, not viable. I mean, you can't tell people not to worry about something that's very near them. And my own view is that for some time, Americans have been overheated about this. And I think Europeans have been slightly underheated on it, actually. But just very quickly, if I may, there is another reason we haven't touched on yet, but it is a market force within journalism which we haven't dealt with. In the same way that there was a period when the British police seemed to find it most useful to be on Twitter all day, and finding people who'd aired on Twitter, and people wondered why this was the case. And I was saying, well, it's obvious, isn't it? It's much nicer to do that than to go and find robbers and things. It's sort of more restful. In the same way, for journalists, it's much nicer to report this sort of the cycle than it is to go onto the ground and do the stuff and actually get people interested in stories which they didn't know that they would find interesting. I came back from northern Nigeria the other week where I was researching the massacres that are taking place there. And, you know, there's not much interest in this country in Nigeria. But part of the reason is that the British press don't send journalists to these places. And so you get around to say, well, journalists don't want to read about Nigeria, you know. And so it becomes all part of it very, very quickly. Another very interesting point of this phenomenon and the complexity of where we are in it. Look at what became the picture of the year at the Press Awards ceremony the other day. The photograph of the assassin of the Russian ambassador in Turkey standing over the body of a man who was who was alive only seconds before, standing over that. Now that was all over the press. And we had no problem with it. It was a dead Russian on the floor by a live, heated... and when you consider that the British press has no problem doing that, but absolutely, you know, pardon my French, you know, needed to change its trousers over reproducing a cartoon a few years earlier, you realise the sort of craziness that we're in.
Yeah.
You know, you're taking your life in your hands if your publication publishes a cartoon, but everyone's got the dead body of the Russian everywhere.